stream in 3, 2, 1.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone across the Zoom dome and around the world. You're welcome to the April 2023 edition of the African Literature Association Lecture Series, the last episode in this academic year. My name is Akin Adeshokan, and I teach comparative literature and African cinema at Indiana University, Bloomington. It's been my pleasure for nearly 3 years to coordinate this series with my colleagues in the Executive Council of the Association, especially Matthew Brown of the University of Wisconsin-Madison and James Mark Cockle of William and Hobart College in Geneva, New York. The series began almost 3 years ago at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic that forced a global lockdown. But it was also an imaginative initiative suggested by the president of the association at the time, Professor Grima Negash of Ohio State University, and it has continued to receive the support of the Executive Council and particularly of the subsequent presidents, as Mohammed Kamara of Washington and Lee University and Gaurav Desai of the University of Michigan, who is our current president and a co-organizer of the series. We also acknowledge the technical support of Alexis Langendorf, our web development assistant. In the main, the lecture series is meant to engage the intellectual and professional attention of our members outside of the conference calendar, and it has had the benefit of opening literary studies up to other areas of the study of artistic expression, moving on to those other fields in the humanities and the social sciences invested in the generation of new knowledge in the sphere of life. In all spheres of life, excuse me. As always, we acknowledge the continuing support of the other members of the council, as well as the larger membership of the association. Due to your continuing attendance and attention, the series has come to stand in the past 2 years as a publicly engaged feature of the association's presence. In this age, when public engagement is roughly equivalent to be socially or civically responsive, and we thank you all. Our guests today are scholars of African cinema with new or recent books in the field. ROS GRAY is the author of Cinemas of the Mozambican Revolution, Anti-Colonialism, Independence and Internationalism in Filmmaking, 1968 to 1991. And Boukary Sawadogo's African Film Studies, An Introduction, is a textbook that has just appeared in its 2nd edition. We are particularly gratified to have these two scholars for reasons that I must state without equivocation. The field of African cinema is quickly diversifying into many subfields, with a wide range of thematic handles seizing on film, video, and other formats to pursue different kinds of agenda. That is how it should be, with a form that is fully alive and makes its appearance in the nexus of socio-economic and technological dynamism in multiple spheres. At the same time, however, it is heartening to see works such as we'll be discussing today that do not take the ideological origins of the field for granted, redirecting our attention to the partially told story of the role of filmmaking in the process of political change, and bringing scholarly issues to the level of the elementarily teachable. You'll hear more from the speakers about this in a moment. We start with ROS GRAY, a reader in fine art and critical studies and program director of the MA Art and Ecology at Goldsmiths, University of London. She serves on the editorial board of Third Text and is a member of the Critical Ecologies research stream. Her research currently has 2 main trajectories. The first explores networks, its aesthetics, and the impact of militant filmmaking, particularly in relation to liberation struggles and revolutionary movements in Mozambique, Angola, Portugal, Guinea-Bissau, and Burkina Faso. The second focuses on artistic intervention in the field of soil care, cultivation, and decolonial ecologies more broadly. Her book, Cinemas of the Mozambican Revolution, came out in 2020, just on the cusp of the global lockdown. So it is a delightful opportunity to be able to listen to her talk about the book, which explores how the unique cultural revolutionary filmmaking that Mozambicans imagine as the task of delivering to the people an image of the people, how it began during the armed struggle against Portuguese colonialism, excuse me. Ross, it's your turn to turn on your video and audio. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Akin, for that very generous introduction, and thank you for this invitation, and to everyone at the African Literature Association. It's really an honor and a great pleasure to present my book, Cinemas of the Mozambican Revolution, here to you today. So what I'm going to do is talk a bit about the scope of the book, and then I wanted to, in a way, zoom into a couple of films that the book discusses to give a bit of a sense of the approach of the book and some of the kind of key themes that it covers. So kind of zooming in and out to different parts of the book. So as Akin just mentioned, the book is about the films, the filmmaking, and the film culture that was dedicated to anti-colonial struggle in Mozambique. And once independence was achieved in 1975, to the effort to use the moving image for the purpose of social change during a socialist revolution led by Frelimo. So this socialist project lasted for some 10 years, as I'm sure most of you know, until it began to fall apart under the pressure of war and economic collapse. And at the heart of this institution, was an institution, the Instituto Nacional de Cinema, or the INC, that was set up in 1976, and which began the task of building a film industry that grew on networks of solidarity with other socialist and non-aligned struggles. Its slogan, "To deliver to the people an image of the people," is a description of its central task that was perceived as crucial to nation building. And it was also a very important part of their work was really to train up a new generation of Mozambican filmmakers who would not have been able to have careers in filmmaking under colonialism. It was also tasked with intervening in the global media flows about Southern Africa, which tended to privilege colonialist and apartheid perspectives. The films of the armed struggle continued to be a crucial resource for the INC after independence, as indeed were the colonial archives that the INC seized after independence alongside the equipment that was owned by colonial production houses. So both these archives of the anti-colonial films and the colonial archives were recycled into documentaries that told new narratives of a nation forged through armed struggle and a new society that would be built through socialism and socialist solidarity. So what I argue in the book is that this was a moment when the world came to Mozambique and Mozambique went to the world through the moving image. I was really motivated to write this book and undertake the research over quite a number of years, some 15 years, by the desire to understand what was singular about this experiment with the moving image and how filmmaking made a crucial contribution to a nation-building project whose radicalism was grounded in socialist collectivization, internationalism, and decolonization. And it really was a unique kind of historical moment in a way, because at that time, television didn't exist in Mozambique, and a large proportion of the population didn't have very much experience of cinema. So there was also a kind of huge body of work at the INC in thinking about what kinds of approaches to filmmaking, what film languages, and what kinds of films would be most appropriate to that context. So the book follows a body of work in filmmaking affiliated to a set of political aims and aspirations. It begins with the films made during Frelimo's armed struggle for independence, the first of which was made in 1968 by a Yugoslav filmmaker called Popovic. And it explores the efforts to harness cinema as an agent of social change, both nationally and internationally, in the context of socialist revolution, through to the Mozambican government's rejection of Marxist-Leninism and the fire that marked the end of the INC in 1991. And what the book does is it frames this history and analysis in relation to the revolutionary politics of that radical moment. And in so doing, it somewhat departs from the categories of national cinemas and world cinemas that tend to structure a lot of contemporary film studies. When I mentioned this phrase, the radical moment, that just now, I'm talking about it in the sense that's evoked in the writings of Henri Lefebvre. And in his writings, the radical moment is not a linear measurement of duration, but rather the radical moment reveals new possibilities that break through the barriers that limit emancipation. So while it signifies a rupture, the radical moment also animates the dual meanings at play in the word revolution, which means both a break with the past and a cosmic cycle. And so it is, in the words of Rob Shields, full of anticipation, insights into the future, and déjà vu. So we see this in the sort of circulation of revolutionary tropes, but also in the way that films come to echo one another across and relate to other scenes of revolution and at other times. So as I said, I'd like to focus on a sort of zoom into a couple of films that were made at different moments of this historical period. They're both films that in some way capture new nations at a crucial moment of radical transition, in which capital cities are depicted as sites of contradiction that reflect both the tensions and the anxieties that the liberation movements faced in attempting to form national governments. And of course, during the armed struggle, Frelimo's strongholds were predominantly in the north of Mozambique and in the rural areas. And so when they came into government, they were concerned about the city centres as a site of counter-revolutionary activity. The other reason why I've sort of my thinking behind the selection of these two films is to sort of think about the importance of international collaboration in Mozambique. And so many foreign filmmakers came to Mozambique and made films, but also engaged in training staff at the INC and elsewhere. So the first film I'd like to talk about is a film directed by the Cuban filmmaker Santiago Alvarez called Maputo Meridiano Novo, the New Meridian. And in 1976, the INC programmed its first festival of Cuban cinema with films supplied by a delegation of filmmakers from ICAIC, the Cuban Film Institute, that was led by Santiago Alvarez. And it was during this visit that Alvarez and his team made Maputo Meridiano Novo. And that film was one of the films that used archive footage that was held by the ANC to tell the story of the armed struggle and its culmination in the proclamation of independence. And it's one of a series of films that Alvarez directed between 1975 and 1978 that addressed Cuban internationalism and solidarity with Africa. And it was the first of two that he made in Mozambique. And of course, this had political significance in Cuba as well, as it was the time when Cuban forces were launching Operation Carlotta, which was, as you know, a massive military campaign to defend the MPLA government from South African troops that were marching on Luanda. And at that time, Fidel Castro was making a series of new claims about Cuba's African heritage that sort of were a new departure for the way in which Cuban internationalism was being framed. So recentering the nation's revolutionary identity around the island's African heritage. The title of the film refers to geographical measurement, of course, but it's also a sort of metaphor for a realignment of the axes of anti-capitalist socialist struggle. And so in particular, the film sets out the sort of dangers facing the new nation of Mozambique in relation to the efforts of Rhodesia and South Africa, who of course at that time both had a white minority rule, to destabilize the country. So as well as archive material, there was footage taken on the streets of Maputo by the ICAIC cinematographer Julia Simoneau. And throughout the film, it's a very interesting film formally because it uses these color tints of yellow and green to kind of code the footage according to ideological persuasion. So footage of Samora Machel in the liberated zones, for example, is coded green, and footage of South Africa and of colonial rule is colored yellow. The music is very important in this film as well. The soundtrack is incredibly important for the meaning of the film. And so there's lots of juxtapositions in the film between the sort of privileges and the sort of modernity of the colonial center and how that compares with poverty on the outskirts of the city. So it's demonstrating the film that there's a still dramatic sort of segregation that is the sort of legacy of colonialism that Frelimo was going to be setting out to tackle. I wanted to show a bit from the very end of the film, after the film's really covered a lot of ground in quite a short period of time. As some of you may know, Santiago Alvarez was known for a kind of rapid editing style of editing together found footage or film footage from other sources. But at the end of the film, the film is notable for its focus on the figure of Samora Machel's first wife, Josina Machel, as a kind of exemplary revolutionary icon. And during the armed struggle, Frelimo had developed a kind of revolutionary figure, the new man, very Fanonian, of course. And there was also the figure of the new woman. So these were disciplined militants who would be an example to those involved in the armed struggle and to furthering the revolution. And so I'm going to share my screen now and show just a few minutes from the end of the film, which include a quote from Josina Machel in Portuguese. And of course, the film, because it's Cuban, it has Spanish subtitles. But what I'm really focusing on is the use of images and juxtaposition here. So just bear with me for a moment while I share my screen. So what we've seen in this extract is a juxtaposition between these really very relaxed scenes of everyday life in Maputo, where the camera follows a crowd of women, including a woman eating an ice cream, a woman carrying a child, and it cuts to this image of Josina Machel in photographed during the armed struggle, in one of the liberated zones, carrying a gun. And this contrast, as the filmmakers conceived it, makes a kind of revolutionary demand, and it's asking what the future of Mozambique will be now that independence will be achieved, and a kind of revolutionary demand to confront the social inequalities that persist in independent Mozambique and the ongoing threats from South Africa and Rhodesia, with the same kind of revolutionary determination that was exemplified by Josina Machel and that drove the armed struggle. Okay, so that's giving you a little taste of one of the films that was made at the cusp of independence, when the INC was just beginning to be set up, and lots of foreign filmmakers were coming to provide training and so on. And now I want to jump to some years later, in 1980, when a film called Pambere in Zimbabwe was made. And this is a film that was made, yes, in 1980, which was the most prolific year for the INC in terms of film production. So it's really a kind of quite very optimistic moment. And it was the kind of, there was a sort of expectation that perhaps the worst was behind them. And one of the reasons for that is that Zimbabwe was about to gain independence, and that seemed to promise greater stability for Mozambique. Of course, the white minority Rhodesian government had been instrumental in setting up the opposition force that came to be known as Frelimo, and its soldiers had been involved in attacks across the Mozambican border. And this was because Mozambique had supported the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe by providing sanctuary for ZANU, and it hoped that a peaceful transition would be beneficial for the entire region. So as Zimbabwe's first democratic elections loomed, therefore, the stakes involved in achieving national reconciliation in Zimbabwe could not be higher, not only for the internal parties, but also for the neighbouring frontline states that had supported them. And it was in this context that the MPLA and Frelimo governments agreed to a project that became perhaps one of the most important and influential films that was made at this critical juncture in the region. So this was, as I said before, Pambere in Zimbabwe, which means Forward Zimbabwe. And it was the first South-South co-production in Southern Africa. And so the aim of this film was to document the transition to independence in Zimbabwe. And it was really made by Angolan and Mozambican filmmakers as a gift from those two governments to the new nation. So it was co-directed between the Angolan Carlos Henriques, who worked for Televisão Popular de Angola, and João Costa, or otherwise known sometimes as Funcho, who had a lot of experience. I mean, both of them had a lot of experience in camera work in situations of conflict. So the rest of the crew was made up of Mozambican filmmakers and Angolan filmmakers, as well as some of the international cooperants working at the INC. So the cooperants were international workers who had a strong ideological identification with Frelimo, usually, and they were paid to help with training and provide expertise, which was lacking, and so they played an important part of the INC. So one of the cooperants who worked on this film was the Canadian editor, Ofra Hallis, and the British filmmaker Simon Hartog also played an instrumental role in securing some of the funding. And it's a film that was shot in 16mm, which meant that the negatives had to be processed in Harare, as the INC laboratory only had facilities at that time to develop black and white. So what's significant about this film is it really tries to tell the story of the transition from the perspective of ordinary Zimbabweans, as well as their political leader. So it situates Zimbabweans' independence in terms of regional geopolitics and Pan-African affiliations, rather than from the point of view of the white minority, and without the condescension of the British officials overseeing the transition, which tended to dominate Western media reporting. So it reflected the importance of representing this historic event from an African perspective, and an international awareness of the need to decolonize a media system that was entering a new stage of globalization. So this was an awareness that had been sort of mounting across international bodies. And the film starts with images of the stone ruins of the medieval city of Great Zimbabwe, and a voiceover sort of sketches out this historical context for the struggle for independence in Zimbabwe across a sort of long history of resistance. And it includes a historical explanation of the colonization of Zimbabwe by the British South African Company, and the founding of Rhodesia in 1895, named after the company's instigator Cecil Rhodes, who we will come back to shortly. And it uses colonial photographs and sort of describes the colonial extraction of natural resources and so on. There's a lot of footage also of kind of key moments in this process of transition. And some of them are quite extraordinary documents, such as meetings between ZANU and ZAPU forces and the Rhodesian army at the assembly points. So these were designated places where returning guerrillas were instructed to gather. And also very notable footage of Zimbabweans participating in the country's first democratic elections, independence ceremonies, and street celebrations. So it's the story of the transition told through footage often shot at shoulder height in the midst of crowds in the street, at polling stations, at places of work and rural labour. Interspersed through Pamberi Zimbabwe are excerpts from an interview with Robert Mugabe, who emphasizes that this is a moment of anxiety as the defeated power is still in place. And while the inclusion of these excerpts privileges Mugabe's account, the film is careful to acknowledge the cross-party effort to work for a peaceful transition. But most of the interviews in the film are not with political or military leaders, but with people who range from whites who are visibly tense and anxious about the future to jubilant Black youths who express their joy and hopes for an emancipated Zimbabwe. So the film importantly aligns itself with those people who are being liberated by independence. There's a very notable scene at the assembly point of Zapatsi, where the guerrillas are addressed by Rex Hongo, and he's really sort of trying to smooth everything over, speaking in a very funny way about how they need to sort of find a rapprochement with the Rhodesian army, and that they'll all be part of the same notion. And just immediately following that, the Cobran Shinks leads a sort of rousing song, which tells a quite different sort of story in a way. The song is called "You Have Been Defeated, You Imperialist Exploiters." So often the songs are used in quite subtle ways, and with an awareness of the different audiences who would have had, some perhaps that would have only spoken English, for example, to give a sort of a sense of like who the sort of real victorious forces are. So the soundtrack is incredibly important to the political meaning and power of this film, and often it is used in a sort of way to sort of overlap and carry the music into a sort of make transitions between different kinds of footage, functioning as a kind of connective device between different moments of transition. So the Zimbabwean Shimaranga song set the scene for the Rhodesian army's tense encounters with the guerrillas, emphasizing that the white minority machine is actually in the position of a humiliating defeat, even though their stiff deportment suggests residual feelings of superiority. And as well as Shimaranga songs, the songs of Bob Marley also weave through the soundtrack. So Marley's 1978 song, Zimbabwe, had become a kind of anthem of global solidarity with ZANU and ZAPU. Like many of his songs of Black suffering and resistance, Zimbabwe conjures a Pan-African imaginary that crosses the Black Atlantic, extending the aesthetics of the film to encompass a transnational third worldism. As a Black vernacular intellectual in Grant Farad's phase, Marley's music functioned as a kind of mode of intervention into the dominant public sphere. Its prominence on the soundtrack echoes the way in which Pamberi in Zimbabwe sought to have a powerful impact on international understanding of what independence in Zimbabwe meant for its people and for the world. And there's a very beautiful sequence at the end of the film, which has the soundtrack is Bob Marley's Redemption songs, and it plays over a series of images that juxtapose the luxurious existence that white settlers enjoyed with the poverty of Black Zimbabweans. And, so this simple device of juxtaposition displays the reality of a stark sort of segregation. So traveling shots of lavish suburbs are contrasted with the destitution of slums. Black women cook on wood fires in the street, while the kitchens of the white bourgeoisie are well stocked with alcohol. Soldiers patrol the city streets in armored vehicles. White men play golf, followed by their black caddies. Children carry and chop firewood, while white girls play hockey at an exclusive school. Finally, the song moves into the final chords. An image of two black infants is superimposed over Harare's skyscrapers and colonial buildings. And as the images glide over one another, one of the children momentarily seems to hold the statue of Cecil Rhodes in his hands. And I just wanted to share this powerful image with you. So I will share my screen again. And this is one of the quite see how to make it full screen, but anyway, hopefully you can see the image well. It's an image that I included in the book, and every time I watch the film, this moment I find quite electrifying, and of course it has renewed resonance in the present day because of the Rhodes Must Fall campaigns and so on. So, and of course, Black Lives Matter movements in many parts of the world. And of course, children are a very powerful symbol of the birth of a nation and hopes for the future. And this sort of use of juxtaposition recalls a number of films made at Mozambique's transition to independence that were endlessly projected in cinemas and by the mobile cinema units in Mozambique, not least Robert van Leerop's O Povo Organizado, which makes an acute diagnosis of the challenges facing Frelimo in reconciling the contradictions and segregation produced by colonialism, particularly in the urban areas. So in Pamberi in Zimbabwe, there's no overbearing analytical voiceover, but rather a kaleidoscopic portrait of a nation fused out of seemingly irreconcilable parts. And Mali's music on the soundtrack endows the sequence with an emotional depth that has an almost spiritual dimension. By the late 1980s, regional cooperation in film production had grown, in fact, but it reflected solidarities that had been forged during the struggle for independence and in the support that Mozambique gave to other liberation struggles, and for the necessity of the frontline states to present a united front against apartheid. Pamberi in Zimbabwe provided aesthetic inspiration for the making of documentaries that made an intervention into international media to give African perspectives as part of the struggle against white minority dominance in Southern Africa. It also was important in that it led to a series of collaborations that showcased the professional skills of filmmakers in Angola, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. And as state institutions and socialist aspirations of those nations crumbled, these South-South collaborations persisted through the 90s and were sustained through the connections forged between individual filmmakers in these crucial years, rather than through support from their governments. Even as the INC faced the mounting crisis in Mozambique, ideas for regional cooperation were discussed at the Conferência Africana de Cooperação Cinematográfica in 1977, were taken up and elaborated collaboratively in Zimbabwe, in the Frontline Film Festival in Harare in 1990 and in other projects. So I mentioned that the making of Pamberi in Zimbabwe took place in the INC's most productive year. After 1980, the institution really began to feel the impact of the war and the economic crisis, and that this began to affect film production. Although they did manage to make two major fiction feature films, and the Kusha Kanema newsreel continued for the next few years. However, Production was also shifting focus to television, and the INC and the cinemas that it ran were falling into disrepair. Following Frelimo's shift away from Marxist-Leninism, film production was privatized, and in 1991, the year of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the INC suffered a catastrophic fire. What emerged across the region in the 1990s, however, were new hybrid modes of filmmaking, some of which built on techniques of documentary to make fiction films, while others used techniques of fiction to make documentaries. These allowed previously unacknowledged voices to be heard. They would include much more prominently the perspectives of women articulating their struggles within patriarchal societies. And I really want to sort of, in a way, finish on that note that although the INC was no longer functioning, there has been a really lasting legacy of the INC's work through film, a sort of generation of filmmakers working in film and in television who've continued to make films and carved out something really distinctive for Mozambique. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much. That's quite rich and wide-ranging. We appreciate you sharing this with us, and I'm hopeful that there will be questions from our audience and also from our side as well. So thank you. Our next speaker, our second speaker is Boukary Sawadogo, an associate professor of cinema studies and Black studies at City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, CUNY. He has authored books and articles on African cinema, is the founder, director of the Harlem African Animation Festival. His research and teaching interests concern popular genres such as comedy, TV series, and animation, African cinema history, theory and industry, and the development of African cinema curriculum and teaching on learning resources. Beyond African film and media industries, Dr. Sawadogo's work has been widening in scope and depth to include a study of the encounters and exchanges between Africa and the diaspora around Harlem. It is among African immigrants and African cinemas and African American film culture. His books include West African Screen Media, Comedy TV Series and Transnationalization, and Africans in Harlem, an Untold New York Story, which came out last year. He'll be talking about his latest book, African Film Studies, an Introduction, and the subject of his presentation today. Your turn, Boukary.
Hi, Akin, and hi, Ross. Thank you, everyone. And also thank you for those who are in attendance close and miles away. So I'm going to share my screen here for, let's pull this up. Okay. So yeah, my talk here is about the second edition of my textbook, African Film Studies and Introduction. This is the latest edition is an expanded one in terms of not only the chapters from the first edition, which has been reviewed, expanded, and also the addition of new chapters in this edition. The new chapters include Ethiopian cinema, Nollywood, a chapter on local African TV serials, and a chapter on the streaming, what I call the streaming rush for Africa. So this is the new, the second edition. Now, okay, let's move to something very personal, but also that has bearing on the life of this project, how it came to be. I personally came to this project. I moved to City College, City University of New York in 2015, and I was assigned one class, which is Introduction to Film Studies, and I proposed and created one class that is African Cinema, Gender and Culture. So for Introduction to Cinema Studies class, I was given one syllabus to to use it. And from that syllabus, I could see that there is no film from Africa, and it's mostly it's heavily Hollywood based. And the only film that was outside the US was a Good House film. And the second class, which I proposed and created, African Cinema Studies, African Cinema, Gender and Culture. And so that is a new experiment for me. But what's transpired from those two classes is the request for students for learning materials. They ask me, is there any textbook that we can purchase for your class? This is the question that we all received at the beginning of the semester. And I said, no, there is no textbook. And the one semester after the other, the same questions kept coming. And I felt that it was important to create initially a document for my students. And as I was working for that document, I added more materials, and I thought that a textbook should be created because the demand was there, but also looking at the wider landscape, it's something that should serve more than my students, but also serve teachers who has little to no prior exposure to African cinema. So before African Film Studies and Introduction, what was out there when it came to resources for learning and teaching African cinema? Obviously, very little. When I say little, I'm not talking about the scholarly production, because I really make this clear cut distinction between scholarly production, scholarly books and articles that we write and that are mostly conversation between scholars, and which sometimes, most of the time, I should say, doesn't lend themselves to the grasp of undergraduates who hasn't yet have that critical background. So prior to the textbook, I did the research. We have two articles. Three articles. The first were two, both by Betty Ellison, which is teaching African women in cinema, which grew out from her blog, Women in African Cinema. And the third article is by Joseph Gagler, African Films in the Classroom. So those prior to the first edition of my textbook, which came out 2019, were the one that I found as resources, classroom resources. And was one book that I found, which is a high school textbook in the UK, titled Teaching African Cinema Video and Teachers Textbook. And so we can say in summary, you have three articles and one high school textbook on African cinema. And maybe the question is why, for as long as we can remember, I don't want to say we'll go back to the 80s or for almost 40 years or even almost 50 years, why we didn't have pedagogical material for teaching and learning African cinema. I think this is a question that should be asked. I don't have a clear answer to that question. The same way I'm scratching my head on why on the continent we still don't have a degree, degrees in African cinema. I think those are the things that at one point need to have actions enacted because yes, African cinema is on the margin within the larger field of film and media studies, and I think the starting point would be to expand the audience at the learners level, and also developing curricular and programs, I would say on the continent, but also beyond the continent. What are the two objectives? The two objectives for this textbook. The first one is obviously developing a pedagogical resource for teaching and learning African cinema, because for some of us who has been fortunate enough to go back regularly to the content, we have access to films and filmmakers, readily access to films and filmmakers that not everybody does. So I think to have a manual out there, it's very important if those opportunities that are afforded to us is not available to everyone. And second, which is very, very dear to my heart, is with widening the circle of African cinema intervention. Because so far, yes, we have the growth, and I would say very growth of scholarly books and articles on African cinema every year. Because if we take, I don't think there have been studies done on the subject of the number of monographs and articles that are published every year on African cinemas, but how much material, learning materials, pedagogical learning materials are out there, are published. It's the balance is really skewed toward the scholarly productions, and I understand that for me, some of the explanation is yes, you have scholars we need for our own professional advancement and also and productivity. That's one reason, but also on the other end, I'm talking about scholarly production, but also we need to think about how this can be accessible to a wider audience if we want to grow the field beyond a conversation among scholars. The book organization, how the book is organized. The book is organized along four parts. And first one is history, aesthetics, and criticism of film. And the fourth part is diversity in screen media productions in Africa. So in history, the history part is made up of two chapters. The first one is history of cinemas in Africa, where I take a look at African experiences of cinema during colonial, era, from that time to the present day, with Nollywood, with streaming, with the intervention of transnational giant media company in Africa, like Netflix, like Disney. So it's a very wide in scope, and obviously one chapter cannot cover everything, but is an introduction. Also part of the history, is a chapter where I make the comparison between African cinema and African American cinema, and that's a title of the chapter, Parallel Movement. Why? Because so far the conversation is just bypassing each other. So at one point, there should be contact zone. Yes, there are contact zones, but it is not expanded as it should be. And aesthetics addresses creative elements like cinematography, animation, and music in African cinema. And criticism is a chapter that give an overview of some of the most recurrent critical approaches used to study African cinema. And the fourth part, which is diversity in African screen media production, that's where I showcase, that's where I talk about Nollywood and talk about Ethiopian cinema. And thank you, Ross, for your presentation, because for the third edition, I'm already started working on a chapter on Angolan and Mozambican cinema, because I think that need to be included, and obviously two more chapters, one chapter on women in African cinema and one chapter on the North African cinema scene. So, and what are the growth sectors? The growth sectors that the textbook tackles when it comes to African cinema. The first one is TV serials, or the TV shows, and it really started to boom mid 2000. Otherwise, we go back to the first post-colonial locally produced TV series. It's the late 1990s, but starting 2000 onward, we see the development of local production. Why? Simply, it's at the conversions of the scarcity of lack of funding for cinema, live action, big budget productions. So TV series are seen or regarded as where with a shoestring budget, films can be made, production can be made, and the audience is also already there, given the popularity of foreign TV serials at the time. Talk about Brazilian, South American, Central American, and European TV series. And now we've seen also the intervention of US media giant like Disney that proposed co-productions for animation, or Netflix when it launched the first original African shows or series with Queen Sono and Blood and Water in 2020 during the height of COVID. And animation, particularly with the younger generation who are mostly self-taught, harnessing the possibility of technology, using YouTube tutorials, but also attending workshops that are given in their countries. I would say now transforming the media landscape on the continent. I think it's now rising to the top of the attention, but it's something really to pay attention to. I would say, unfortunately, it has taken this long, because looking back at the history of the animation practice on the continent, it should have been been more subject of books and articles, because going back to the productions of Mustafa Al-Hassan, considered the father of African cinema, or even post-colonial era, with the words of Boloko, 1953 to 1955 in Belgian Congo, then moved to the second generation, from the 60s, the first generation, and the 80s, 90s, the second generation of animators like the South African William Kentridge, the Congolese Jean-Michel Kibushi, the Burkinabe Mustafa Dao, or the Malian Kadidiatou Konate. This current generation is really booming, particularly at the intersection with gaming. And another sector that's obviously growing is streaming, but also that comes with a caveat, which is the structural challenges facing the consumers on the continent. And here I'm talking about having a reliable power grid and a cheap and reliable internet connection. And that's not always available. But what is also true is streaming is picking up steam on the continent, and the content now with mobile phones is, I would say, will be shaping, if it's not already shaped, productions mode, because more and more shorter productions will be the norm when it comes to consumption on our handheld devices. And the book also touches on issues that I think should rise to our attention as educators and also scholars. The first one is restitution. Restitution for a number of years, let's say for the last 3 to 4 years, past years, restitution of African arts has been at the forefront of the conversation, and we've seen countries like France, like Germany or Belgium, taking steps to return some of their, the arts. But when it comes to film, I think we have seen something bubbling underneath in terms of the restitution of copies of old African films held in the West that sometimes are not readily available on the continent, or even filmmakers, African filmmakers who complain that they don't have access to their own copies of their own films, or sometimes they even don't know what institution hold the copies of the films. And here I'm talking about films from the 60s, the 70s, and even the 80s. So this is something that at one point will need to be addressed. And I'll finish with film and new media education, where it's challenging myself as an educator, but also putting the question out there for other educators to start thinking about it. Because in terms of film education, film studies, we train scholars, critics, filmmakers who will be in activity for the next 40 years. So projecting with the technological changes, how can we anticipate those changes? Because we already live in a heavily saturated images, world saturated with images, and also in terms of production and distribution, the modes are changing. And what do we need to keep in mind? Or even what is even, the definition of a film? What is the definition of cinema? Because we've seen how this has been changing even for Hollywood, or even theatrical distribution. So, and the way writing classes has functioned in academia as being writing class, student has to take a writing class regardless of major, because writing is considered very essential to academic success, but also success outside of academia. For me, also knowing how to produce and edit and distribute images, let's say media content, will have the same function in the coming years, and students need to have that film or media production education the same way writing has been functioning in academia. Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thanks to both of you for these very stimulating and wide-ranging discussions about African film. Quite a lot to think through, and actually quite gratified as always that there's always in moments like these very unpremeditated moments of connection that are sort of established. So that's really quite gratifying. As always, we expect to hear from our audience on YouTube, and just saw a notice from our moderator, web assistant, that there are no questions on YouTube yet. So audience, if you're listening, as I'm sure you are, please try to engage with us with these questions. I do have questions to start off, and I really just want to start with a question for Ross, and then one for both of you, and then I'll come to Boukary. So for Ross, I'm quite gratified by the point you made regarding the ideological task of the film movement itself, the very idea that what the institute wanted to do by setting up this institute, what the government or the Frelimo wanted to do in 1976 when this was set up, was to deliver to the people an image of the people itself. So I'm just interested in how you can share with us a couple of examples of how, in very concrete, exemplary terms, that we can really understand of how this was attempted or achieved through film, given that this was actually its central objective. The reason I'm asking this question is because you may be familiar with William Finnegan's book called A Complicated War, which is essentially an attempt to tell the story for an American audience, or if you want, for a Western audience, about the war between the Portuguese and also and Frelimo, and secondarily with Renamo. And he makes a very interesting point there about how images of Samora Machel were being used in a way that made him or other outsiders think of such use as attempts to install or start some kind of personality cult around the president. That is, everywhere you went, you saw the image of Samora Machel. But from the point of view of people in Mozambique, the idea was actually that most Mozambicans in the late 60s, early 70s, around the time of the war, had no idea that the country had a Black leader, that they really, especially in the countryside. So I'm assuming that that you can actually tell us about this, because this is sort of related to the idea of delivering an image of the people to the people themselves. So if there are stories that you can share, very concrete stories in your research, that would be helpful to start off.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I mean, obviously for most of the rural communities of the Mozambican population at that time, during the armed struggle, they were very much oral culture, and so images, media images, were something that was quite new in a way. And so Frelimo really recognized the importance of that, and they even if they couldn't set up say a screen to project a film during in the liberated zones, they would maybe use images to show people that there were other people around the world who had similar struggles, but also to inform them about, for instance, who Samora Machel was. And one of the first things that one of the first films that was made at the time of the transition to independence was a film called From Ramuva to Maputo, which was again directed by this Yugoslav filmmaker Popovic, and it followed Samora Machel as he made the journey through Mozambique to Maputo, because in Maputo and through much of the country, Samora Machel was not, he was a sort of shadowy figure until that point. And during that tour, he made a series of public speeches where he was really using a kind of Mozambican Portuguese idiom. So there would be a strong identification with him from the audience. He made lots of jokes. He's a very charismatic speaker, and working through sort of figures of speech and symbols that became quite commonly used in sort of Frelimo's discourse. And so this was in a way Frelimo introducing him to the Mozambican people, and the film captured that, and the sort of hundreds and hundreds of people who would come to see him. And so then that film was then taken out in the mobile cinema units and shown in the villages again and again. It was a very popular film. But there's also this question of like making an image of the people for the people. What does that mean? And a lot of the INC predominantly made documentaries, but it also made information films. So actually using cinema to serve the people, to provide them with important information about health, about safety, about what was going on in the country, about the new systems, the new political system that was being enacted, how to make a vote, for example, and so on. And so that required quite a lot of debate and discussion about what were the best ways of doing that. For instance, if you have a community that's not so familiar with filmmaking, it might be really confusing to show a mosquito that's like several meters wide, right? Because these questions of scale, or it might be offensive to crop part of someone's body off in the editing. So those kinds of things, particularly the more grassroots projects, where some filmmakers at the Instituto de Comunicação Social, the Social Communication Institute, were working with villages to help them make films that then, when they were, for instance, forming a cooperative, that could then be shown in another village to show them. For example, there's one called Tijolos, which is about making bricks. And so it's showing the method of making bricks and then showing it in another village so they could learn how to make bricks, but also get an understanding of what it meant to make a cooperative. So I think that there was also a sort of sense that they needed to make a new story about Mozambique. And that there's, it's just fascinating, Boukary, to hear your talk and to think about the work of education that has been such a central part of the filmmaking of that period. And they were also teaching people about film. So in fact, the discourse that the INC, the information that the INC published about films was really sort of lucid, really pleasurable to read, writing about the films, the film festivals, for instance, that they created, of African cinema, of Algerian cinema, of Italian neorealist cinema, and so on. So kind of in a way training up cinema audiences about filmmaking as well. There was the boycott that the international distributors started after independence. They boycotted Mozambique. And so initially at first, the INC was having to rely on a lot of Soviet films, Eastern Bloc films, and so on. So there was a very interesting kind of mix of films that people were exposed to at that moment. And I think this idea of like, what is cinema for in this moment of transition and radical change? And so information, education, of course, propaganda as well. The INC was a very centralized organization as well. So they saw themselves as sort of sending out films across the country. And then there were more marginal projects that had a sort of a different focus, maybe on more a kind of slightly more democratic modes of filmmaking, more grassroots modes of filmmaking as well.
Okay, well, thank you. That's very helpful. So there's a question for you, but since we want to hear from Boukary too, maybe I'll ask a question of both of you first, and then come to a question for you, and then go back to Boukary. So the question for both of you is essentially about how your books came to be written, because when we started this series, the idea was also to give first-time authors or even young scholars who really are trying to think about how to work on their first books, how to do it. So if you don't mind, no, these are very different kinds of books, but they are books, and it's always very helpful for people who are trying to know the form or the genre, so to speak, to get an idea of how this is done. So in very simple, maybe stage by stage manner, if you can just sort of share with us how you came to this project and how you executed it. I think Boukary sort of mentioned that at the beginning, but it's also helpful to, in the process of writing itself. That's actually the part that we always want to understand. So if you want to help us, we can start with Boukary, then come to Ross, and then we'll come to another question. Thank you.
Okay. So as I was saying, it grew out of classroom need for material for my students, and then expanding it to the larger community out there. So at the time, it was very tough for me because I just joined the city college from a tenure track job onto a tenure track job. So obviously, the pressure is there to produce to get tenure, and to be honest, the initial feedback that I got is that a textbook is considered of less value than a monograph. So if you want to get a tenure, focus on it, traditional monograph. So but already by that time, the way I function personally, by the time I finish a book, I've already started working on another. So it's always a lot of overlapping, because I have in mind that it takes 5 to 6 years for a book to be from project, to finish. So I always do that. So as I was working on the textbook, I had a completed manuscript for West African screen media. So then, that gave me a little more less pressure to work on it, but also the reality, if you have senior colleagues or telling you that textbook, it's it's not so for lesser value, it's not an encouragement for you to do it. You have to really feel passionate and see that maybe you see something that people don't, even if you think that you are at the lower rank of a profession. Concretely, I started writing chapters. I would say almost 3 times a week I write, and to the point that sometimes your social lives, takes a hit because you have to keep writing, and then it took me 2 years to have a first manuscript for the textbook, and then send it out to. I reached out to colleagues to read and give me feedback. And for some of my colleagues, younger colleagues, or younger as me, who are out there, you will reach out to other colleagues and they will tell you that, yeah, they will love to read, but they don't have time. So I'm just saying that taking no, you have to accept that, take that no, and just, keep moving, because, yeah. And then obviously for my particular case is English is not my first language, and my first language is not even French. But so for me, I'm not saying this to just throw under the bus colleagues who write in French and have someone translate. So everyone could do their own work. I'm just saying that I write everything. I'm better at writing than even speaking. So I write mine, everything. So if you are out there and English is not your first language, or, so if I made it, you can make it. I'm just talking for colleagues out there. And then obviously you have to put a book proposal and to publishers, and you can make that decision first. But looking at what are the titles in your field, what are the publishers? That's one way of looking at it. And second, taking the advice or recommendation of colleagues in your field, or even your head of the department, if you are publishing for tenure, and then you put together the proposal, submit it, and then get the external reviews. And on that level, yeah, your confidence can take a hit too. So but you have the reviews, and then hopefully you get a contract, and from there on will be revision.
Thank you. Ross?
Yeah, such a great question. Thank you. I mean, my book took a long time to come, and so there were many years of writing shorter articles and talking at conferences, but also, you know, the whole field transformed from when I was doing my PhD and I wrote 2 chapters about Mozambican cinema in my PhD to now when there's very much more films are digitalized and available, and there's a whole network of people writing PhDs, but also screenings and programs and so on. So that's been really, really exciting to witness and to be a part of. So I think in a way, my book wouldn't have been possible without that emerging context of, you know, not only research taking place in relation to what happened in Mozambique, but also in relation to Cuba and in relation to Yugoslavia and so on. So you can start to sort of, you know, in a way, create a kind of map of these, I called it a cinegeography in another special issue that I did with Kojo Eshin, a cinegeography forged out of cinema affiliations and connections and the movement of films and filmmakers. And my own method with writing, well, when I'm doing research, I tend to take a lot of notes. And for this book, I also did a lot of interviews, and there was a sort of long process of kind of finding the structure that would make sense, because obviously it has quite a kind of a large scope, and I needed to find a way to sort of navigate through all of that different material. And I think also when you're talking about people's lives histories, just the really importance of building relationships and hearing lots of different perspectives. Right. And so that was really one of the very exciting parts of the research was the connections that I made with people who had been really kind of played a key role at the INC and at other filmmaking organizations in Mozambique. And, you know, some of them had not, some of them are still working in the film industry. Some of them hadn't thought about that work that they'd done in Mozambique for like many decades. And so that was also kind of really kind of wonderful part of the research, really. But yeah, I completely agree with Boukary. You got to be prepared for lots of advice that you might not feel like hearing. It's all good, and also just giving up the time to write intensively in that sort of final year or two when you're really trying to push the book out.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Thanks to both of you. Now, there are questions from our audience. There's a question for you, Ross, from Ranka Primora. You have mentioned the Yugoslav director Dragutin Popovic twice now. Can you say more about his role in Mozambique and how he got there?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the time of the sort of the non-aligned movement, and of course Yugoslavia was really important in the non-aligned movement, and so actually Popovic was one of a number of filmmakers who were in Tanzania when the Mozambican armed struggle was beginning. And of course, Tanzania hosted Frelimo. And so at a certain point, it was agreed that Popovic and another cinematographer would go to the liberated zone and try and make a film. There were other filmmakers who came at around that time. The British filmmaker Margaret Dickinson, a team from China as well. So this was part of a kind of internationalist effort to support Frelimo through filmmaking. And Frelimo was very good at forging these relationships with solidarity groups in other countries and with governments that were sympathetic to their cause. So it was a really kind of crucial part of their work, actually. That was Ramova Maputo and behind no, sorry, not Behind Lines. And the first film that Popovic made were kind of like a moment when the relations between Frelimo and Yugoslavia were very strong. After independence, Yugoslavia was not so involved, and then in the 1980s they did a co-production with Mozambique, which was the film Os Tempos dos Leopardos, which is a fiction film about the armed struggle. Very, very popular film in Mozambique, probably one of the most popular Mozambican films ever made. And it was also at the time when, sort of really at the end of the non-aligned movement, when Yugoslavia was very well known for making partisan films, so films about their own armed struggle. So there was an affinity there and a sense of connection, and so that was one of the reasons why, because Yugoslavia had its own experience of armed struggle, it felt an affinity for that they gave support to Algerian filmmakers and also to Tanzania and to Mozambique and elsewhere.
Does that film have an English title? Do you know?
From Remover to Maputo.
Oh, is that what it's called? Okay.
Yeah, so it's from the Remover River, which is the border between Tanzania and Mozambique, and this journey down that Samora Machel made, making speeches along the way, right down to Maputo, which is in the south.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you. Now, another question also from Ranka to Boukary. I don't know whether you've seen it, but I'll read it out so that other members of the audience can hear it. How might we teach the revolutionary aesthetics of movies such as Pamberi in Zimbabwe to students who win on Hollywood?
I think I see the two methods or two pedagogical ways of going about it. The first one is to introduce students to what I call the tradition of cinemas or movement that challenge mainstream cinema at a time. So there is an historical succession of examples. I'll give them, and then from those examples, you can introduce students how those movements challenge what was considered mainstream cinema at the time. The first one, historically, we start with Italian neorealism, which at the time was considered very revolutionary in terms of its aesthetics of everyday life instead of the grandiose themes. And then from there, we can move to the French New Wave, which was in terms of aesthetics, very using mobile camera to go into small corners and fighting, because with French New Wave, it's simply, if in terms of aesthetics, it's fighting against French cinema of the 20s and 30s and 40s, which were basically literally adaptations. So, and here you see those French critics that comes and want to do French cinema differently, and then from there continue what I call the historical arc to third world cinema, and from Africa, from China, from Latin America, proposing a different aesthetic construction to filmmaking than the dominant one, which is Hollywood. So for me, giving that historical arc is one way of doing it. The second one is, contextualizing it within the US, but taking the example of African American cinema, how it's mostly independent, and in that category, existed or exist side by side, or trying to fight an existence along Hollywood, and that we can go back to Oscar Michaud, to the current productions of high-profile Black American filmmakers or Black American actors. Another way also of doing it within the US context is to look at the LA Rebellion. The LA Rebellion movement, which is the 1960s, people of color wanting to present aesthetics on people of color, which is, I don't say defined, but rejecting the stereotypical representation of people of color in Hollywood movies. So those are, for me, ways of going about it.
Yeah. In fact, it's good that you mentioned the idea about early rebellion, especially for a film like Bush Mama, where Haile Gerima particularly uses negative film and black and white, which sort of resonates with what Usman Semben used to say about the use of color film, that for a very long time he did not want to use color film because of the way in which it was coded to represent black skin in a way that might be too overly anthropological. I thought that was very interesting, which now leads me to the question. Thank you very much to a question about a point that Ross made about color coding in the film. So I actually was intrigued by that, and I wanted to ask you because if it was for ideological reasons, I imagine that color coding material might be red because it was, radical, if you want, communist. Though he wasn't. Ideologically speaking, he was less interested in labels than the very idea of radicalism. But you said it was often coded green. And South Africa, or the kind of oppositional idea of those who were opposing the revolution, were coded yellow. So what was the rationale for those colors, if you want to sort of share that with us, please?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I'm not sure that there was a symbolism with the color in that way. I think it's much more about creating a contrast. And in a way, it's also a film that is Santiago Alvarez's films are very dynamic to watch, quite sort of almost acidy, and so I don't think that there was. I completely agree with you that red would have seemed like a more obvious color, but in a way also green has associations with peace as well. So maybe they were sort of thinking about, I don't know. I mean, it's a really interesting question. I actually don't have an answer for that. But I mean, interesting you should mention about the issue around color film and how problematic it's been for in terms of racial representation. And this was a discussion that they had actually at the INC, and there was people arguing that they shouldn't use Kodak film, for example, for that reason. So there were intense debates around aesthetics that were also arguments about technology, and so an understanding that technology is created by particular social conditions as well, right? And it serves certain social conditions. So in a way, if you're trying to use the moving image to create a new society, you're also inheriting a whole set of technological conditions as well. And so, I mean, what Boukary was saying about the sort of new mediascape now, where people can teach themselves how to make videos and things are much more handheld. At the time when the INC was set up, you had to, if you made a film, you had to wait weeks and weeks and weeks to actually see for it to be developed, and the cameras were very heavy. So one of the reasons why they used 16mm was that it was much more portable and so on. So a whole set of discussions that were obviously about budgets and so on, but also about, what kinds of technologies and what kinds of aesthetics were most suited to the aims that they had for using the moving image in the cause of the revolution.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, so Boukary, I have another question for you while we, as always, wait. So the question has to do with the point you made about the viability of African film studies on the African continent, in African university itself. So I hope I'm hearing you right, and so if I'm not, please do correct me. Were you talking about the need for departments that are specifically offer degrees in African cinema, or are you talking about the very teaching of African cinema in the continent, in universities across the continent? Because I do know of some programs, especially in Nigeria, that offer degrees, not necessarily a department, but where the teaching of African cinema is sort of foregrounded and prioritized. And so I just wanted you to be aware of that, and but also to sort of get clarification about the point we were trying to make.
No, I'm not making, if misunderstood, I'm not making the point that we should have a department of African cinema on the continent. That would be great. But I'm just saying that, making the larger point that if we would, instead of always repeating the same tired critique that African film studies is on the margin within the larger field, which is yes, but I'm like, okay, let's also look at on the continent where maybe more work need to be done there. Okay, if work is done there properly, then automatically, the outside world will just follow through. And I'm taking the examples like, if you look at how many degree granting programs in African cinema do we have on the continent? And I personally know of UCT, University of Cape Town, which used to have one. I don't know if it closed it or not, but not a lot. So that's what I'm saying. The work need, we cannot talk about African cinema on the continent. It's not even there, because, and I'll give one concrete example. In Burkina Faso, I know many film schools, but, to have, like in the book, I talk about cinematography, to take like the basic film technique and teach it around African films or African filmmakers, it's not happening. It's still around, I don't know, I have nothing against Godard or, Western, iconic figures. It's still around them. But yet you have films and filmmakers, for almost 60 years now. How not about changing the perspective? And so that's really, my main point,
Okay. All right, that's clear. A question for you, which we'll quickly read just to break the flow of me basically asking questions. And then while we wait for that, I may ask another question of Ross just to keep things going. But so the question is from Jean Buddha. And the question is that you have mentioned that your first language is not French or English. And so have you thought of taking some steps to write something in your African language to motivate youth in your field, essentially maybe using More or whatever it is that's your first language?
Exactly. I think that as if, Buddha read in my mind, because I just completed my next book manuscript, and which is part memoir, part travel log, where I wrestle with that question, and I've expanded on it in saying that I may never know the joy or what it means to think and write in my first language.
Which is what? Can you tell us? Because
which is More.
More, okay.
Yeah, I will may never know what's to think critical, write, share knowledge, disseminate knowledge. I may never know it. Which I'm not saying that I will be more effective, but simply that we know that language carries vision of the world. So to translate that vision of the world, I'm looking forward to it, because I have propositions to translate some of my book to French, but I'm looking forward to one that will be able to translate it into More, because I know that I'm not a Gugi Wafiongo or something to that effect, but I'm just, thinking how that will help enlarge and widen some of the conversations.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. Well, good luck. Well, thank you for doing that. I'm sure you didn't write it in More, though.
No, it's in English.
But we're on the way. That's good. Thank you. So I have a question for you, Ross, if I may, please. So there's a case, especially with Mozambican filmmaking, of mostly European filmmakers such as Jean Rouch and Jean-Luc Godard playing some kind of role in this history, but the extent of their involvement is not well known to, known to film scholars. Mantia Diawara discusses in African cinema, and I think Claire Andre Watkins also mentioned aspects of it, but it's not really very well known. And I'm just wondering whether in your research you uncovered some details or stories about these aspects of the filmmaking that you want to share with our audience. Sure.
Yeah. No. I mean, I do write about both Godard and Rouch in the book. You know, as I said before, there were a lot of international filmmakers who were coming to Maputo at that time, and to Mozambique at that time, and some of them were cooperants, and some of them came with a particular kind of project, like Rouch's. So, I mean, Godard was actually, it's quite an interesting story because he was invited by Frelimo to come and advise on approaches that they might take to setting up television in Mozambique. And it was a bit of a controversial decision to invite Godard. Not everyone agreed. Georges Rebello, I think, was quite against it. Funnily enough, when he first arrived in Maputo, he didn't really know what to do, right? He spent a few days waiting around in Hotel Polana, not really doing anything. And eventually some filmmakers from INC recognized him, and that's how they made the contact and so on. And he really wanted to be very involved and envisaged, you know, making a film and so on. And he did publish an article, a very beautiful article with some photographs in Cahiers du Cinema about the research he carried out there. And, you know, a number of filmmakers at the INC accompanied him and worked with him, making photographs. And he was very interested in like what it meant to show people images of themselves, and so you see those kinds of photographs of that happening in Cahiers du Cinema in the article. I mean, it didn't really lead to anything, because actually what Godard wanted to do was a sort of quite radical project where his company would sort of set up this grassroots television type production, and that really wasn't what Frelimo envisaged for a national television production, perhaps not surprisingly. But there were actually some projects when television was set up in the 80s, where people working for the Instituto de Comunicação Social worked with villages and trained them up to make, they were correspondentes populares, so they're popular correspondents, and they were making little short reports that were shown on television about, often at that point, about how the war was affecting their everyday life and how they were resisting and so on. With Rouch, Rouch came shortly after independence, and he had a project with Eduardo Mondlane University, and that was involved. He was very interested in the possibilities of Super 8. And he trained a number of students and trainee filmmakers in how to use Super 8. And there was a legacy of that project, and he also made some films and so on. So a group of academics and filmmakers did a project with Super 8, which was connected to this project that I was talking about before, about helping people to set up cooperatives. So working in rural areas and using Super 8 to work very closely with communities, and to sort of in a way try and make the kinds of films where they had an input into sort of how it was edited and so on. So this was quite a small project, and actually, unfortunately, some of the footage got destroyed in a Renamo attack. So some of the films that were made as part of that project were lost, which was obviously a great shame. But I think I mean, it's important to think about the whole range of sort of collaboration that there was, and so that's something I tried to do justice with in the book. That there were filmmakers from Brazil, filmmakers from Canada, filmmakers from many parts of the world, and there were also these collaborations with filmmakers in Zimbabwe and Angola as well. So I guess what I've tried to do in the book is to do justice to this this moment when there was a sense of possibility for what could be done in Mozambique at that time, when Frelimo was open to filmmakers coming and making a contribution.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you. So we're actually getting to the end of our time. We usually try to stop around 12:45 just to be kind or considerate to our audience and also to you also. So I have one last question for both of you, and you can basically take the time that you want to answer, to address this question. Boukary, my question is, you spoke while you were responding to Ross's presentation that it's giving you an opportunity to think of a further revision to the book, maybe a third edition of it, and that set me thinking about to ask you about what motivates the revisions to your book. You talked about growth areas and the need to be inclusive which are very legitimate. I mean, for instance, like what's going on in Mozambique or Angola, we need to know those things. But can you tell us how these editions, this is the second edition, have fared in terms of use? I use some of the chapters in my courses, but with new edition, I may even consider assigning the entire book. So what are the reasons that you sort of do these periodic, apart from growth areas? I mean, in other words, what feedback do you get in terms of how these books are being used?
I get feedback from users, mostly teachers who sign the book. Who I will give one example is of giving the name, like what is African cinema, the chapter. I have the film by Jean-Pierre Bicolo, and one teacher reached out to me and said the film is very difficult for my student to process it, so do you want to change it as a case study to a different film? So criticism of African cinema, the same teacher told me, but the first edition, so how come Bicolo gets two of this film? So I'm like, okay, I'm going to change it to the Senegalese film Atlantic. So we have a feedback from people that who use it a lot, and also during I would say the external review process. The external review process, one key point that was made across with 3 reviews were like, the first edition was heavily aesthetics and technical. Can you make it more palatable to non-expert? So that's how I had to introduce other chapters like streaming, local African TV serials, without getting too technical about it. Okay. And the third reason is obviously update of information that I have to keep all the time, because like for example, what is African cinema? I use the UNESCO report that came out October 2021, saying that the African cinema has a potential of 20 million jobs for 20 billion revenue a year. And then you start to ask yourself, what is, in terms of ramification, in terms of business, how will that require? Is it training, where we see Netflix bringing in money, scholarship, or is it infrastructure construction, or is it film, or is it developing sustainable local film industries? And if that's the case, how do you bring consumers to pay for content? Sorry to say it, but consumers who are used to getting free content online.
Yeah.
And also in terms of payment system, I learned about it that it's not in the US or in the global north where you have your credit card, debit card, you can consume across borders. For much of the continent, I'm not to generalize, but I've talked to many who carry projects in that area. It's very difficult to have a payment that cross borders very easily, like we do here to consume online.
Yeah.
So those are feedback, update information, and also try to be as exclusive as possible.
Thank you. Now, that also sort of makes the question I had, the final question for us, quite relevant, which is that in the conclusion of your book, you mentioned you talked about the afterlives of this cinematic history, and I'm just interested in whether there are stories that you can share about how that's really manifested. I mean, I know because I've read the book, but most of the audiences don't know or may not. So especially in terms of how the questions of reuse, whether you have examples about reuse or remix of some of the iconic films or newsreel through curation or reformatting through digital format and all of that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, the INC suffered this catastrophic fire, and just at the time when the film industry was privatizing its production side. And what that meant was, so when I first went to Mozambique to do research in 2004, so there actually hadn't been an inventory made of which films had been destroyed in the fire and which had survived. And so, you know, to see the films was quite difficult. I mean, they were sometimes shown on Mozambican TV, but as a researcher, that was a challenge. And sometimes filmmakers gave me access to their own films. There was the wonderful documentary by Margarida Cardoso, and that film did a lot of work actually in terms of putting a spotlight on the history of the INC and the condition of the archive at that time. And it was really, Margarida Cardoso was in Mozambique to make another film, to make a film that was an adaptation of a novel by Lydia George about the colonial war from the side of the Portuguese family. And the Mozambican filmmaker Gabriel Mondlane showed her the archive, and I think he was doing something very canny there in showing her that, because you know that led to her making this really wonderful documentary Kusha Kenema, Birth of a Nation, which really kind of garnered more attention to the state of the archive. And then some years later, the Cinemateca Portuguese sent a team of archivists to go through and make an inventory of which films had survived. And what they found was, fortunately, while the International Film Archive had been destroyed, the National Film Archive had pretty much survived. I mean, some of the films were in poor condition, but they had pretty much survived, which is obviously really great news. And an interesting thing was happening at that moment, because there was a beginning of a sort of interest by contemporary artists in militant filmmaking. And so in this sort of spaces of contemporary art became a space where there were screenings of films, there were, use of re-adaptation of certain films or collaborations with filmmakers, because of course that generation of filmmakers were getting older, and they knew that they'd been part of something really significant. So filmmakers like Serra Maldoro or in other countries, you know, they had things to share. And you know, when I first met José Cardoso, he showed me his personal archive of images and so on. It was extraordinary. And some of those people are no longer with us, so it was quite urgent to do that work, really. And so, I mean, I think that one of the things that I wanted to do with the book was really to provide a lot of context, because I think there is a risk of those films being decontextualized. And I think with the films of the armed struggle as well, you know, obviously they show the Frelimo in a very positive light. And some of them, such as Gibuza, are in those films reading their own poems and so on, and so they have a kind of power still. But I think there is a problematic when images, these very powerful images, sometimes quite violent images, get decontextualized and shown in a way that isn't adequately understood. And I think that some of the earlier anti-colonial films that were made by foreign filmmakers, you know, they were really not made for a Mozambican audience. They were made for European or American audience to show what colonialism was doing. Yeah. And what I have observed when some of those films are rescreened is it's quite traumatic, actually, to see some of those films. So thinking about Ranka's question for Boukary, I think another side to that was also thinking about context of teaching, you know, and the kind of some kinds of images, you know, that were made at the time that seemed to be useful for a certain purpose don't sit so well in the present day. So, you know, I think that that's another important thing that we need to think about. And there are films that I wouldn't show to a class of undergraduates, because it just you need to really understand the context and, you know, understand the reasons why you would want to watch that film again, you know, and those kind of distressing images.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thank you. Actually, these questions came up in, you must have seen Spare Reel by Philippa Cesar, who actually worked on the archives of the Guinea-Bissau, especially through the intervention of Anita Fernandez, who was invited to Guinea-Bissau by Sara Maduro and her partner, Mario Diadrandi. So it's actually a very interesting history in terms of what they've done with the film is to actually, in other words, remix the archive, which was also degenerating through neglect. And as you said, it wasn't a fire, it was like coup and other material conditions that actually made it impossible for the films to be in existence. And so what they did was to, if you want, curate it and put some context to the films that some Guinea-Bissau people have never even seen before. So it was through some kind of mobile screening that people actually became aware of what happened when the war was going on in Guinea-Bissau in the 60s and the early 70s. So anyway, thank you for that. And thank you for this extremely rich and stimulating discussion. We appreciate your time and the knowledge that you've shared, and really, really very appreciate it. This brings this event to a close. We're close to the end of, we are slightly ahead of, behind in terms of time, but it's really very stimulating. We could go on. I have a few more questions, but I can share those with you privately at a later time. So thank you. And it's also the last time in this series, because what we do is end in April, just so we can leave May for our association annual conference. And so for that reason, we are grateful and thank you for your time, and hope you have the good rest of your afternoon or evening, as the case may be in your for you, Ross, as I know, I assume it is in England right now. So thank you, and
thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Take care now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.